The helicopters arrived exactly 17 minutes after she lost everything. Helen Carter was sitting on a curb outside Metropolitan Children's Hospital, crying into her dead mother's stethoscope when the sky started screaming. Two Black Hawk helicopters, military-grade, descending fast, and the armed medic who jumped out wasn't looking for the chief of pediatrics or the head surgeon or anyone with doctor in front of their name. He was scanning the crowd of shocked bystanders, shouting one question over the rotor wash. Where's the nurse they just fired? This is the story of how saving one child's life destroyed a career and how saving another one exposed 30 years of corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. 17 minutes earlier, Helen had still believed in the system. She stood in the main corridor of Metropolitan Children's Hospital, surrounded by witnesses, nurses who wouldn't meet her eyes, residents suddenly fascinated by their shoes, orderlies who'd worked beside her for 6 years, now backing away like she had something contagious. The late afternoon sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows with a brightness that felt designed to humiliate her, spotlighting her shame for maximum visibility. Dr. Raymond Williams didn't need to raise his voice. 30 years of institutional power had taught him that authority was about presence, not volume. His white coat was so pristine it could have been a uniform, his posture so rigid he might as well have been carved from marble. This was a man whose name appeared on plaques in 3 different hospital wings. A man who believed the medical hierarchy was holy scripture. And Helen Carter, 28 years old, drowning in student debt, still grieving a mother who died in these same corridors, had just committed the unforgivable sin. She'd saved a child's life without asking permission first. Gross negligence. Williams delivered each word like a surgeon making an incision. He wasn't looking at Helen. He was looking at the crowd, performing this execution for their education. Violation of direct medical orders. Unauthorized administration of blood products to a minor without documented parental consent. Helen's throat felt like it was closing. Stephen's organs were shutting down. His oxygen saturation was 72%. Waiting another 90 minutes for his parents to arrive would have given us time to do this properly. William's voice sharpened for the first time, cutting through her explanation like it was background noise. You don't make those calls, Nurse Carter. You are a nurse. Skilled, perhaps. But nurses execute treatment plans. Doctors create them. When you pushed past me and accessed that blood bank refrigerator without authorization, you didn't just break protocol. You undermined the entire command structure of this ICU. The heat rising to Helen's face was part shame, part fury, and entirely paralyzing. She wanted to scream that Stephen Washington, the 7-year-old boy with sickle cell disease who'd been gasping for air 2 hours ago, was alive right now because of what she'd done. She wanted to point at the monitors behind her showing his stable vitals, his normalized oxygen levels, and his living body as proof that she'd been right. But 6 years of institutional training had taught her that being right didn't matter if you weren't allowed to be right. I created a viable patient outcome, she managed, hating how small her voice sounded. Stephen is a lawsuit waiting to happen. William's eyes finally found hers. They were the color of concrete, and just as warm. His parents could sue this hospital for unauthorized treatment. Do you comprehend the legal liability you've created? Do you understand what you've done? Behind Williams, Helen could see the other nurses. Jessica, who'd trained her. Marcus, who'd celebrated with her when she got her critical care certification. Ms. Eleanor at the back, 25 years at Metropolitan, survivor of 3 hospital administrations. A woman who'd watched this exact scene play out before with other young nurses who dared to question Williams' authority. None of them were looking at her now. Ms. Eleanor's lips moved silently. Helen thought she saw, "I'm sorry," forming, but no sound came out. Not sorry enough to speak up. Not sorry enough to risk 25 years of seniority for the truth everyone in this corridor knew. Helen Carter had saved a child's life, and Dr. Raymond Williams was punishing her for making him look incompetent. Pack your personal belongings. Williams was already turning away, dismissing her existence with the casual cruelty of someone who'd done this before. Your access to our electronic medical records system has been revoked. Security will escort you to your locker. You have 15 minutes. After that, you're trespassing. Helen stood there holding Stephen's patient chart, every vital sign she'd documented, every medication she'd administered, every small victory in the battle to keep that boy alive, and realized she'd just written the evidence for her own conviction. The crowd dispersed like mourners leaving a funeral they hadn't wanted to attend. Helen felt the weight of their relief. Better her than them. Better this young nurse with ideals still intact than veterans with mortgages and retirement accounts and families depending on their silence. She turned toward the glass doors, massive floor-to-ceiling barriers separating the hospital from the outside world. Through them, parking lot, street, city sprawling into an afternoon that suddenly looked hostile and unfamiliar. She had nowhere to go. Studio apartment she could barely afford. Father who hadn't spoken to her in 3 years, not since she'd chosen nursing over business school. Mother died 15 years ago and now worked herself to death in this very hospital. Another nurse who'd given everything to a system that gave nothing back. Helen's hands started shaking. The tremor crawled up her arms, into her shoulders. These were hands that had placed IVs in premature infants with veins thinner than thread. Hands that had performed chest compressions until her muscles screamed. Hands that had held Stephen's terrified face and promised him he'd be okay. Right now, facing those glass doors about to eject her from the only place she'd ever belonged, those hands felt utterly powerless. She walked. Each step felt like moving through concrete. The doors opened with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like a final breath. September air hit her face warm, thick with exhaust and hot pavement. Somewhere distant, a siren wailed. Another ambulance bringing another emergency to a hospital that no longer wanted her. Helen stepped onto the sidewalk. The glass doors closed behind her with a sound like a judge's gavel falling. She stood there, 28 years old and completely alone, clutching her mother's stethoscope. The vintage Littman with Elena Carter's name engraved on the chest piece in letters worn smooth by decades of use. Her mother had died believing her work didn't matter. Had died thinking she'd wasted her life serving a system that treated nurses like disposable equipment. The first tear cut down Helen's face, hot and humiliating. Maybe her mother was right. Maybe saving lives didn't matter if you didn't have the right letters after your name. Maybe. She felt it before she heard it. A vibration. Deep. Rhythmic. The kind of sound that makes windows rattle and car alarms scream and the air itself feel heavy. Helen looked up. The sky above Metropolitan Children's Hospital was tearing open. 2 Black Hawk helicopters, massive, military-grade, painted in tactical colors that meant serious business, were dropping through the clouds like predators diving on prey. They weren't heading for the rooftop helipad. They were descending toward the main entrance, toward the parking lot, toward her. The rotor was hit like a bomb blast. Papers exploded into the air. Car alarms shrieked. People screamed and scattered. But Helen Carter didn't move. She stood there, patient chart pressed against her chest, her mother's stethoscope swinging against her scrubs, and watched as the cavalry arrived. Not for Dr. Williams. Not for the hospital administration. For the nurse they'd just thrown away like garbage. The lead helicopter's door was already sliding open before the skids touched pavement. Helen believed in saving lives and second chances. Now she needs your support. Like and subscribe if you believe Helen deserves a better life. Share this video because we are one family. Comment what city you are watching from. The alarm on monitor bay 3 started screaming at 2:47 p.m., and Helen Carter knew immediately that Stephen Washington was dying. She was at his bedside in 4 strides, her hands already reaching for the oxygen saturation probe clipped to his small finger. The numbers told a story that made her stomach drop. Oxygen sat at 71% and falling. Heart rate climbing past 130. Blood pressure trending down. Stephen's lips had gone from pink to gray to a terrifying shade of violet in the span of maybe 90 seconds. The 7-year-old boy looked up at her with eyes that were starting to glaze, his small chest heaving with the effort of pulling air into lungs that were being starved by his own misshapen blood cells. Sickle cell vaso-occlusive crisis, the worst one Helen had seen in her 6 years at Metropolitan. His blood was literally clogging itself, organs shutting down cell by cell. "I can't breathe," Stephen managed, each word a battle. "I know, sweetheart. I know." Helen's hands moved on autopilot, adjusting his oxygen flow, checking his access. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead, running through the protocol she'd memorized in nursing school and refined through dozens of pediatric emergencies. He needed blood. Fresh, oxygen-carrying red blood cells to flush out the sickled cells before his kidneys and liver failed entirely. She turned to call for Dr. Williams and found him already standing in the doorway, tablet in hand, face creased with annoyance at the interruption. "Acute chest syndrome," Helen said, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline making her heart hammer. "He needs an exchange transfusion. Now." Dr. Williams walked to the bedside with the unhurried pace of a man who'd never known urgency. He glanced at the monitors, then at Stephen, then back at his tablet. "Where are the parents?" "Stuck in traffic on I-95. There was an accident. They're at least 90 minutes out. Then we wait for parental consent." Williams' tone suggested the matter was already settled. "Hospital policy is crystal clear on blood product administration to minors without. He doesn't have 90 minutes. Helen heard her voice rising and fought to control it. "Look at his renal output. He's produced less than 5 milliliters in the last hour. His kidneys are failing." Williams didn't look at the catheter bag. He looked at Helen with the expression of a teacher disappointed by a student's simple error. "Protocol exists for a reason, Nurse Carter. We've already contacted the parents. They're aware of the situation. We wait." Dr. Williams, with respect, his oxygen saturation is below 70. "If we don't, we wait." He said it slowly, as if speaking to someone hard of hearing. "That's non-negotiable. I will not expose this hospital to a lawsuit because you're feeling emotional about a pediatric case." He turned toward the door. "Page me when the parents arrive." Helen stood there, hands gripping the bed rail, watching Stephen struggle for each breath. She could hear her mother's voice from 15 years ago, back when Helen was 13 and shadowing her mom during a school career day. "Sometimes, baby girl, you have to choose between doing what's right and doing what's allowed. The brave ones choose right and deal with the consequences." Her mother had died at 53, exhausted, unrecognized, silenced. Helen looked at the blood bank refrigerator across the ICU. She looked at Stephen, whose small hand was reaching for hers. She looked at the doorway where Dr. Williams had disappeared. Then she made her choice. She crossed to the refrigerator, overrode the access protocol with her credentials, and pulled 2 units of O-negative packed cells. Her hands were steady as she verified the blood type against Stephen's chart, as she primed the tubing, as she connected it to his 4. "You're going to be okay," she whispered to Stephen as the dark red blood began flowing into his arm. "I promise." His oxygen saturation began climbing within minutes. 74, 78, 82. The gray tinge left his lips. His breathing eased. Helen was documenting the transfusion in his chart when she heard the footsteps behind her. Dr. Williams' voice was ice. "What did you just do?" She turned to face him, still holding the chart. "I saved his life." His face had gone rigid with fury. "You violated a direct order. You administered blood products without consent. You've exposed this hospital to—" He stopped, seeming to remember they weren't alone. His eyes swept the ICU, noting the other nurses, the residents, all of them frozen and watching. He raised his voice deliberately. "Ms. Carter, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Security will escort you out." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "Dr. Williams, please. You're a liability," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You've demonstrated a complete inability to follow medical authority. You're done here." Helen felt the chart slip from her hands and heard it clatter to the floor. 6 years of perfect evaluations. 6 years of night shifts and double shifts and learning and growing. Gone. Erased. Because she'd chosen a child's life over a policy. She looked at Stephen, now breathing easy, color returning to his face. Worth it, she thought, even as her career shattered around her. "Get out," Dr. Williams said, pointing toward the glass doors at the end of the corridor. And Helen walked. The corridor stretched ahead of Helen like a gauntlet. Every step toward the glass doors felt like walking underwater, time distorting and thickening around her. The other nurses had scattered the moment Dr. Williams made his pronouncement, melting back to their stations with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned not to be witnesses to institutional executions. But she could feel their eyes tracking her movement, could sense the weight of their relief that it was her career ending and not theirs. Jessica stood at the medication cart, suddenly fascinated by a bottle of saline. Marcus had discovered an urgent need to check the crash cart in Base 7, his back deliberately turned. Even the residents, young doctors barely older than Helen herself, found reasons to study their tablets with intense concentration. Only Ms. Eleanor met her gaze. The older nurse stood near the supply closet, her weathered hands clutching a stack of linens she didn't need. She'd been at Metropolitan for 25 years, had trained half the nurses on this floor, had survived 3 hospital administrators and countless doctors who thought nurses were interchangeable parts in a machine. Her lips moved silently, forming words Helen could read, even from 15 feet away. I'm sorry. Not sorry enough to speak up. Not sorry enough to risk her own 25 years. Helen nodded once, a tiny gesture of understanding that felt like forgiveness even though it shouldn't. She knew the math. Ms. Eleanor had a daughter in college and a mortgage and retirement that was finally, mercifully close. Speaking up meant losing all of it. Helen knew because her own mother had made that calculation 1,000 times and chosen silence every time until the weight of it killed her. She stopped at her locker, number 42, the metal door covered in the remnants of 6 years. A faded postcard from a nursing conference in Boston, a photo of her and her mother from graduation day, a silly motivational quote about nurses being angels in scrubs. She peeled off the photo carefully, then reached for the stethoscope hanging on the hook inside. Her mother's stethoscope, the vintage Littman with Elena Carter's name engraved on the chest piece in letters worn smooth by decades of use. She didn't take her extra scrubs, didn't take the protein bar she kept for double shifts or the travel-size bottle of ibuprofen. Just the photo and the stethoscope and the patient chart she was still clutching because some part of her brain refused to let go of the documentation that proved she'd been right to save Stephen's life. The walk to the glass doors took a lifetime and no time at all. They slid open with that soft pneumatic whisper, the sound of finality. Helen stepped through and heard them close behind her with a click that sounded like a lock turning. The September afternoon hit her like a slap sunshine, so bright it felt aggressive, heat radiating off the asphalt parking lot in shimmering waves. The world outside the hospital looked exactly the same as it had this morning when she'd walked in for her shift, back when she still had a career and a purpose and a future. Her apartment was 30 minutes away by bus. She had maybe $800 in her checking account and $73,000 in student loans. No family, except an estranged father who'd told her nursing was beneath her potential. No backup plan, because nursing had been the only plan since she was 13 years old watching her mother work herself to death in these same corridors. Helen walked to the curb and sat down hard, her legs suddenly unable to hold her weight. The patient chart landed beside her. The stethoscope pooled in her lap, the metal still warm from being pressed against her chest. And then the tears came. Not the gentle, dignified kind, the ugly kind that made her shoulders shake and her breath hitch. 6 years of dedication reduced to nothing. 6 years of learning and growing and saving lives, erased because she dared to act when a doctor told her to wait. Her mother had been right the system ate women like them and spit out the bones. Helen pressed the stethoscope to her chest, feeling the metal against her sternum, and sobbed. That's when she felt it. A vibration, deep and rhythmic, thrumming through the ground beneath her. She looked up, tears blurring her vision, expecting to see a thunderstorm rolling in. But the sky was tearing apart for a different reason. The sound resolved into something mechanical, something massive. Rotor blades cutting through air. Helen wiped her eyes and stared upward as 2 Black Hawk helicopters dropped through the clouds, descending straight toward Metropolitan Children's Hospital. Straight toward her. The rotor wash hit the ground like a physical weapon. Helen felt it before she saw the damage. a wall of pressurized air that lifted trash from the gutters and sent it spiraling into the sky. Car alarms erupted across the parking lot in a discordant symphony. The saplings planted near the hospital entrance bent nearly horizontal, their leaves tearing free and scattering like green confetti. And then the glass doors exploded. Not shattered, that would come later in Helen's memory as symbolic perfection, but the pneumatic system couldn't handle the pressure differential. The doors blew inward with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, fragments of the frame splintering as the panels slammed against their stops hard enough to crack the safety glass into spiderweb patterns. Helen scrambled to her feet, still clutching her mother's stethoscope, as the two Black Hawks executed a landing that should have been impossible in a space that small. The lead helicopter skids touched down on the ambulance bay pavement with barely a foot of clearance on either side. The second bird hovered above, its door gunner visible in the open bay, weapon at low ready, scanning for threats that didn't exist in a hospital parking lot. The hospital's automatic doors vomited staff into the chaos. Dr. Williams led the surge, his white coat whipping in the rotor wash, flanked by residents and nurses and security guards who'd appeared from nowhere. They all had the same assumption written on their faces: VIP patient incoming. Trauma case. Governor's daughter. Senator's son. The kind of high-profile emergency that required military escort and lockdown protocols. The lead helicopter's door slid open before the skids had fully settled. For figures in tactical flight suits dropped out, moving with the coordinated precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times. 3 were clearly combat medics, assault rifles slung across their backs, medical packs bouncing against their hips. The 4th was a woman, tall and commanding, with a major's insignia on her flight suit and an intensity in her dark eyes that made Helen's breath catch. Helen Carter, the major, shouted over the scream of the rotors. Not a question, a demand. We need Helen Carter. Where is Helen Carter? Dr. Williams stepped forward, his voice rising to match the volume of the helicopters. I'm Dr. Raymond Williams, Chief of Pediatrics. Whatever the emergency. The major didn't even look at him. Her eyes were scanning the crowd with the systematic efficiency of someone executing a search pattern. I didn't ask for the chief. I asked for Helen Carter, pediatric critical care specialist. 6 years ICU experience. Someone tell me where she is right now, or we're losing a patient. Helen's legs moved before her brain caught up. She stepped forward from the curb, still holding the stethoscope, her scrubs wrinkled from sitting, her face probably blotchy from crying. I'm Helen Carter. The major's head snapped toward her. Relief flooded her features for maybe half a second before the professional mask slammed back into place. She crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides. Major Sarah Okonkwo, U.S. Air Force Medical Command. Are you currently on pediatric hemorrhagic shock protocols? Yes, but I don't. Vice President's grandson, 6 years old. A car accident 30 minutes ago. Massive internal bleeding, liver laceration. 3 trauma surgeons and 2 military physicians specifically requested you by name. We have maybe 6 minutes to get airborne before his organs start shutting down permanently. Okonkwo grabbed Helen's elbow, already pulling her toward the helicopter. Move. Dr. Williams' voice cut through the noise, sharp with outrage. Major, that woman was just terminated for gross negligence. She violated direct medical orders. She's not authorized to. Okonkwo stopped, turned. The look she gave Dr. Williams could have stripped paint. Doctor, I don't care if she was just fired from Disneyland. I don't care if she violated the dress code or parked in your special spot. 3 of the best pediatric trauma surgeons in the country looked at this case and said one name: Helen Carter. She's the only specialist within 200 miles with the specific expertise we need. So unless you want to explain to the Vice President of the United States why her grandson died because you were having a jurisdiction pissing match, I suggest you step aside. William's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Okonkwo turned back to Helen. Carter, in the bird. Now. Helen looked down at the stethoscope in her hands. Her mother's stethoscope. The one piece of equipment that had survived Elena Carter's entire career. She looked at the shattered glass doors, at the colleagues still frozen in the entrance, at Dr. Williams, whose face had gone purple with impotent rage. Then she ran for the helicopter. Okonkwo boosted her up through the door with one hand. Helen's sneakers hit the metal floor, and she was immediately shoved into a jump seat by one of the medics. Straps came down over her shoulders. A headset was jammed onto her head. "Go! Punch it!" Okonkwo screamed into her comm. The Black Hawk didn't lift off so much as it lunged into the sky. Through the open door, Helen caught one last glimpse of Metropolitan Children's Hospital falling away beneath them, and Dr. Raymond Williams standing in the wreckage of the shattered doors, staring up at the nurse he'd thrown away. The G-force of the helicopter's ascent pressed Helen back into the jump seat hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. Her stomach dropped somewhere around the third floor of Metropolitan as the Black Hawk banked hard left, nose tilting forward, accelerating into a flight path that felt more like a missile launch than medical transport. Through the open door, the city sprawled beneath them in a blur of concrete and glass, the hospital already shrinking to the size of a child's toy. Helen's hands were still locked around her mother's stethoscope, and the patient chart she'd somehow carried through the entire extraction. The chart. Stephen's chart. Evidence of the decision that had destroyed her career 20 minutes ago and apparently made her essential now. Major Okonkwo dropped into the seat across from her, yanking her own headset into place. Her voice crackled through Helen's earpiece, cutting through the rotor scream with military precision. Patient brief. 6-year-old male, approximately 22 kilos. Motor vehicle accident, T-boned on the passenger side, presenting with massive blunt force trauma to the right upper quadrant. Ultrasound confirmed grade 4 liver laceration with active hemorrhage. Estimated blood volume loss 40% and climbing. We've pushed 4 units O negative, but his pressure keeps dropping. Blood pressure is currently 70/40 and trending down. The numbers hit Helen's brain like bullets, each one painting a picture that got worse with every detail. A 6-year-old's total blood volume was maybe 1.5 liters. 40% loss meant he'd bled out over half a liter more than 2 full soda cans worth. His body was running on fumes and failing fast. But something else clicked into place. Something that made Helen's grief evaporate like water on hot asphalt, replaced by the cold crystalline focus she'd spent 6 years honing in the ICU. The switch flipped. The nurse who'd been crying on the curb disappeared. The specialist took her place. "What's his blood type?" Helen's voice was steady now, clinical, all emotion stripped away. "B positive. You said 4 units O-neg. What ratios are you running? Plasma to platelets to red cells?" Okonkwo consulted a tablet strapped to her forearm. "Standard massive transfusion protocol. 1:1:1. That's an adult ratio." Helen leaned forward, her mind already 3 steps ahead. "His vascular system can't handle adult volumes. What access do you have? Peripheral or central?" 2 peripheral IVs, 18 gauge in both antecubital foci. We couldn't get central access to the field. "Good. Don't try. At his size, you risk subclavian puncture." Helen's hands moved without conscious thought, pulling the stethoscope over her head, draping it around her neck like armor. "What's his current hemoglobin?" Last check was 4.2 and dropping. Helen's eyes widened fractionally, the only external sign of the alarm bells ringing in her head. Normal hemoglobin for a 6-year-old was 12. At 4.2, the kid's blood was basically water. "What about ionized calcium? Did anyone check his calcium?" Okonkwo blinked. I don't think so." "Why would?" "Because you're giving him citrate blood products faster than his little liver can metabolize the citrate. If his calcium crashes, his heart stops." Helen was on a roll now, the clinical algorithm unspooling in her mind like a map she'd memorized in the dark. "What about his core temperature? Is he hypothermic?" Temp was 35.3 Celsius 10 minutes ago. "He's cooling down. Did you warm the blood before transfusion?" The medic to Okonkwo's left shifted uncomfortably. The fluid warmer wasn't sized for pediatric flow rates." Helen closed her eyes briefly, seeing the cascade of errors that would kill this child if nobody corrected the course. They were doing everything right for an adult trauma patient. Everything is wrong for a 6-year-old. When she opened her eyes, Okonkwo was staring at her with an expression Helen had never seen directed at her before. It wasn't the dismissive tolerance of Dr. Williams or the patronizing patience of senior physicians. It was respect. "You're different from the others," Okonkwo said quietly. "Children aren't small adults," Helen replied, the words coming out with absolute certainty. "If you treat them like they are, they die. Their physiology is different. Their blood volume is different. Their compensatory mechanisms are different. A 6-year-old can maintain normal blood pressure until he's lost 50% of his volume, and then he crashes catastrophically. You can't use adult algorithms." Through the open door, Helen caught a glimpse of Metropolitan falling away behind them. She could still see the hospital entrance, the shattered glass doors catching the afternoon light. Somewhere down there, Dr. Williams was probably already calling lawyers, crafting the narrative about the rogue nurse who'd stolen military resources. And Helen realized with sudden, crystalline clarity that she didn't care. She'd spent 6 years seeking his approval. 6 years trying to prove she belonged in his hierarchy. 6 years believing that her worth was measured by whether men with degrees and egos validated her expertise. But the vice president's grandson didn't need Dr. Williams' approval. He needed Helen to be right, and she was. The Blackhawks skids hit the manicured lawn of the vice president's private compound with a jolt that rattled Helen's teeth. She'd barely registered the descent stone walls rising like fortress barriers, Secret Service agents positioned on every rooftop, their rifles tracking the helicopter's approach with the casual menace of people who'd shoot first and apologize to Congress later. The door slid open before the rotors stopped spinning, and hands were already pulling Helen out, rushing her across grass, so perfect it looked artificial. "This way. Move." A Secret Service agent in tactical gear grabbed her elbow, propelling her toward a columned building that looked like it had been a pool house in its previous life. Now it was something else entirely. Windows covered in blackout curtains, generators humming outside, the chemical smell of sterilization hitting Helen's nose before she cleared the threshold. Inside was controlled chaos masquerading as surgery. The makeshift operating theater had been assembled with the kind of desperate efficiency that came from unlimited resources meeting impossible timelines. Military-grade surgical lights blazed down on a table where a small body lay draped in blue sterile sheets. Adult trauma surgeons in borrowed scrubs clustered around the patient, their movements too fast, too jerky, the body language of people drowning and trying not to show it. Monitors beeped their warnings in discordant alarm. Blood pooled in collection canisters beneath the table, dark and too plentiful. The lead surgeon stood at the head of the table, his hands buried in the child's abdomen, and Helen could see from 10 feet away that those hands were shaking. "We can't get ahead of the bleeding." Dr. Henry Reeves' voice was tight, with barely controlled panic. His surgical cap was dark with sweat. "Every unit we put in, he loses too. We're chasing our tails here." Helen crossed to the table in 3 strides, her eyes already scanning the monitors. Blood pressure 72/38. Heart rate 160 and climbing. The transfusion protocol displayed on the hanging 4 bags told her everything she needed to know. "You're using adult ratios," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "His vascular system can't handle it." Reeves looked up, his eyes meeting hers over his mask. She saw the moment he recognized her for what she was: not a peer, not another trauma surgeon, but someone who knew something he didn't. "What do you suggest?" Helen stepped to the table, her mother's stethoscope still hanging around her neck, Stephen's patient chart somehow still clutched in her left hand. She set the chart down on the instrument tray and felt the switch complete. The nurse who'd been fired was gone. The specialist remained. Pediatric damage control, resuscitation. Smaller volumes, different ratios, permissive hypotension. She pointed to the 4 bags. "Cut his fluid rate by 40%. Run 101.5 plasma, platelets, packed cells. And stop chasing normal adult blood pressure." Reeves' hand stilled inside the child's abdomen. "Permissive. You want to let his pressure stay low." If we chase normal adult BP, we'll blow out his vessels and restart the hemorrhage cycle. We need to let him clot first. Keep his systolic around 70, no higher. Helen was already moving around the table, checking access points, adjusting flow rates with a muscle memory of 6 years doing exactly this. What's his core temp? 34.8. He's hypothermic. Someone got me warm saline and wrapped his extremities. Now, her hands were steady as she recalculated dosing, her mind running the math that separated pediatric resuscitation from its adult counterpart. And I need calcium gluconate standing by. His ionized calcium is going to crash from all that citrate blood. The surgical team moved to execute her orders with the relief of people who'd been given a map in the darkness. Reeves worked to control the liver laceration while Helen orchestrated the resuscitation, her voice calm and certain, directing military surgeons through protocols they'd never trained for. Then the monitor alarm changed pitch. The heart rate that had been climbing suddenly plummeted. 160 became 120 became 80 became. Asystole, someone shouted. He's flatlining. The surgical resident reached for the defibrillator. Reeves jerked his hands from the abdomen, eyes wide with horror. Stop! Helen's command froze everyone mid-motion. She was already at the head of the table, her fingers on the child's carotid, feeling for the pulse that the monitor said wasn't there. But it was there, faint, irregular but present. It's a vagal response from liver manipulation. His vagus nerve is firing from surgical irritation. I need atropine, 0.01 milligrams per kilogram weight. That's, the resident started. 0.22 milligrams total. Draw it now. Helen kept her fingers on the pulse, feeling it flutter like a trapped bird. And someone tell me his weight again. 22 kilos. Then draw 0.22 milligrams. Move. The atropine went in through the central line. Helen counted heartbeats against her watch. 5 seconds. 10. 15. The monitor's flat line began to spike. Slow at first, then stronger. 60 beats per minute. 70. 80. The rhythm stabilized. Reeves pulled his hands from the abdomen, the liver repair complete, bleeding finally controlled. He was staring at Helen like she'd just walked on water. How did you know? Because I've seen 30 cases of pediatric trauma in 6 years, Helen said quietly, watching the monitors normalize, the child's vital signs climbing back towards survivable ranges. You've seen 3. The room exhaled collectively. The boy's blood pressure held at 74 systolic. His heart rate settled at 90. The bleeding had stopped. Helen stepped back from the table, her scrubs splattered with blood that wasn't Stephen's, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the crisis had passed. She'd done it again. Saved a child against impossible odds. This time, nobody was going to fire her for it. The door to the makeshift surgical suite didn't open so much as it exploded inward. Vice President Margaret Chin burst through with the force of a woman who'd spent the last hour being physically restrained by her own Secret Service detail, and Helen could see from the agents' faces that they'd lost that battle the moment the child's vital signs had stabilized. Is he? Chin's voice cracked on the second word, her composure fracturing in a way that made her suddenly look less like the second most powerful person in America and more like a grandmother who'd just watched her world nearly end. Dr. Reeves stepped away from the surgical table, stripping off his bloodied gloves. Stable, Madam Vice President. Thanks to Nurse Carter. The sound Chun made wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a gasp, something in between, the kind of noise that comes from a body remembering how to breathe after forgetting for too long. She swayed on her feet, and 2 Secret Service agents materialized at her elbows to steady her, but she waved them off with the irritation of someone who'd spent a lifetime being handled. Her eyes found Helen across the room. Helen was still standing by the monitors, her scrubs decorated with arterial spray and 4 fluid, her mother's stethoscope hanging crooked around her neck. She looked, Helen knew, like someone who just fought a war in a space the size of a pool house. Chun crossed to her with deliberate steps, her heels clicking on the tile floor. Up close, Helen could see the tear tracks cutting through the vice president's makeup, the way her hands trembled as she reached out and gripped Helen's shoulders. You saved my grandson, Chin said. Not a question, a statement of absolute fact. Helen felt the exhaustion hit her like a physical weight. The adrenaline that had carried her through the surgery was evaporating, leaving behind the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd had their career destroyed and resurrected in the span of 3 hours. I just did my job, ma'am. Where do you work? Chin's grip on Helen's shoulders tightened slightly, anchoring them both. The pause stretched for 3 heartbeats. Helen could feel everyone in the room listening, could sense the weight of the question that should have had a simple answer. Metropolitan Children's Hospital, she said finally. I did. Chen's expression shifted, confusion creasing the space between her eyebrows. I was fired this morning. Helen's voice was steady, but only because she was too tired for it to shake. Right before your call came. About 2 hours before Major Okonkwo's helicopters landed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Chen's hands fell from Helen's shoulders, but her eyes never left Helen's face. Fired, she repeated, the word sharp as broken glass. For what? Helen thought about lying, about softening it, about making it sound less damning or more complicated than it actually was. But she was too exhausted for diplomacy, and the vice president's grandson was alive on the table behind them, because Helen had refused to wait for permission twice in one day. For saving another child's life without waiting for permission, Helen said. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes storms. Helen watched something transform in Margaret Chen's face, the grief-stricken grandmother evaporating, replaced by the woman who'd clawed her way to the second highest office in the nation and hadn't done it by accepting injustice quietly. Chen's eyes had gone hard as polished stone. What's the name of the doctor who fired you? Dr. Raymond Williams. Helen added quickly, but please, it's nothing. Chen finished, her voice cutting through Helen's protest like a blade. She turned to a man Helen hadn't noticed before, someone in a dark suit with an earpiece and the bearing of someone who made problems disappear for a living. Marcus, get me the Attorney General on a secure line, and the head of Health and Human Services. And I want to know who runs Metropolitan Children's Hospital's Board of Directors. Names, phone numbers, and how much they donated to my campaign. Marcus was already pulling out his phone. Yes, Madam Vice President. Chun turned back to Helen, and her expression softened fractionally just enough to show the human being beneath the political armor. Ms. Carter, I'm going to ask you to do something difficult. I'm going to ask you to tell me everything that happened this morning. Every detail, every word. And then I'm going to make sure that what happened to you never happens to another nurse as long as I have the power to prevent it. Helen looked past Chun to the surgical table where a 6-year-old boy was breathing steadily, his vitals holding stable, his life saved by the same instincts that had destroyed her career hours earlier. She thought about Stephen, probably still in the ICU at Metropolitan, still alive because she'd refused to wait. She thought about her mother, who died believing her work didn't matter. Yes, ma'am, Ellen said. I'll tell you everything. The federal investigators arrived at Metropolitan Children's Hospital at 7:43 the next morning, 3 black SUVs pulling up to the main entrance with the kind of deliberate menace that made administrators reach for their lawyers before the doors even opened. Dr. Raymond Williams stood in the main corridor with his arms crossed, his white coat freshly pressed, his expression carved from granite and contempt. This is overreach, he announced to the lead investigator, a woman from Health and Human Services named Patricia Gonzalez, who had the patient, predatory look of someone who'd spent 20 years dismantling institutional corruption. I run a tight ship. My record speaks for itself. Whatever that nurse told the vice president. We're not here because of what Nurse Carter told us, Gonzalez interrupted, her voice carrying the flat effect of someone delivering facts rather than accusations. We're here because your hospital is required by federal law to maintain incident reports, and someone very high up the chain wants to know why your incident report database looks like Swiss cheese. Williams' confidence flickered for maybe half a second. Our reporting protocols are exemplary. I personally oversee the Quality Assurance Committee. Yes, we know. Gonzalez gestured to the 2 investigators flanking her, both of them already moving past Williams toward the administrative offices. We'll need access to your sealed records, the ones that require board approval to unseal. You have 2 hours to produce them voluntarily before we come back with a warrant that'll make the evening news. They found the first skeleton 90 minutes later. Incident Report 2019-048, buried in a locked file cabinet in the legal department, marked Resolved No Further Action. A 9-year-old girl named Maya Rodriguez had presented to the emergency department at 11 p.m. with acute abdominal pain. The attending physician had diagnosed appendicitis and recommended immediate surgery. Dr. Williams, serving as on-call administrator, had overruled the recommendation and ordered the surgical team to wait for insurance pre-authorization. The insurance company hadn't responded until 6 a.m. By then, Maya's appendix had ruptured. Sepsis had set in. She'd coded twice on the operating table and died 3 days later in the ICU, her small body overwhelmed by an infection that spread like wildfire through organs that should have been saved by a surgery that should have happened 7 hours earlier. The second skeleton came from 2021. A 3-year-old boy named James Chun, no relation to the vice president, just the cruel coincidence of a common surname, had been brought in by his mother with fever and lethargy. The night shift nurse, a woman named Patricia Okoye, who'd been at Metropolitan for 12 years, had documented concerning neurological signs and requested immediate physician evaluation. Dr. Williams had been the responding physician. He dismissed the nurse's assessment as an overreaction, diagnosed a simple viral infection, and sent the child home with instructions to take Tylenol. James had returned 6 hours later in status epilepticus, his brain swelling from bacterial meningitis. The damage had been catastrophic and permanent. He was 7 years old now, blind in one eye, developmentally delayed, requiring round-the-clock care that his family could barely afford. Patricia Okoye had been written up for creating unnecessary alarm and quietly transferred to a different floor. By the end of the second day, the investigators had assembled a pattern that looked less like medical oversight and more like systematic negligence wrapped in institutional protection. 12 suppressed incident reports spanning 6 years. 3 deaths. 2 cases of permanent disability. Multiple cover-ups orchestrated through a quality assurance committee that Williams had personally controlled, staffed with physicians who owed their positions to his patronage. And then the witnesses started coming forward. Ms. Eleanor was the first. She walked into the conference room the investigators had commandeered with 25 years of silence sitting on her shoulders like stones. Her hand shook as she placed a folder on the table. Personal documentation she'd kept in secret, copies of incident reports that had mysteriously vanished from the official record, notes from meetings where Williams had threatened nurses who questioned his decisions. "I should have spoken up years ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was afraid of losing my pension, afraid of being blacklisted, afraid of becoming another Helen Carter." Jessica came next, then Marcus, then 8 other nurses who'd watched Williams punish anyone who dared challenge his authority, who'd seen careers destroyed and reputations demolished, who'd learned through bitter experience that silence was the only path to survival in Williams' kingdom. The common thread ran through every testimony like a poisoned river. Williams punished anyone who challenged him, but he reserved special venom for women, for nurses, for anyone who existed below him in the hierarchy he'd spent 30 years building. He'd turned medicine into feudalism, and himself into a lord who believed his authority was divine right. Patricia Gonzalez sat in the conference room at midnight on the 3rd day, surrounded by evidence that would take months to fully catalog, and made a phone call to the Attorney General's office. "We're going to need to expand the investigation," she said quietly. "This isn't just medical negligence. This is criminal." Dr. Raymond Williams received the invitation on official vice presidential letterhead, delivered by courier to his office at Metropolitan Children's Hospital at 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning. The vice president wished to thank him personally for the exemplary care provided to her grandson and requested his presence at a press conference that afternoon to recognize Metropolitan's contribution to pediatric emergency medicine. Williams had his assistant press his best suit. He practiced his humble acceptance speech in the mirror. He imagined the headlines: Chief of Pediatrics honored by Vice President. This would cement his legacy, vindicate his methods, prove that his 30 years of maintaining institutional order had been correct all along. He arrived at the vice presidential residence at 2 p.m., walking past a phalanx of cameras and reporters with the confident stride of a man about to receive accolades he believed he'd earned. The Secret Service ushered him to a position just left of the podium, a place of prominence visible to every camera in the room. Vice President Margaret Chin stepped to the microphone at precisely 2:15 p.m., her expression carved from stone and fury. "Today I'm announcing a federal investigation into Metropolitan Children's Hospital," she said, her voice carrying the weight of executive authority, and specifically into the practices of Dr. Raymond Williams, Chief of Pediatrics. Williams felt the blood drain from his face so quickly he swayed on his feet. The camera flashes became strobes, disorienting, blinding. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Chun continued without mercy. 5 days ago, my grandson was involved in a catastrophic car accident. He was saved by a pediatric nurse named Helen Carter, who demonstrated extraordinary expertise in a crisis that overwhelmed experienced trauma surgeons. That same nurse had been fired from Metropolitan Children's Hospital just hours earlier, terminated for saving another child's life without waiting for administrative permission. The reporters erupted. Questions flew like weapons. Williams tried to step back, but Secret Service agents had materialized behind him, boxing him in. "We're going to find out if this is incompetence," Chun said, her eyes finding Williams across the podium, "or something worse. Preliminary investigation has uncovered a pattern of suppressed incident reports, delayed treatments, and systematic retaliation against medical staff who challenged Dr. Williams' authority. 3 children are dead. 2 others suffered permanent injuries. Wanna know why?" A reporter shouted over the chaos. "Dr. Williams, did you prioritize insurance approval over a child's life?" Williams' mouth opened and closed. His practiced speech had evaporated. This is out of context. You don't understand the complexities of hospital administration. Legal liability requires. We have the incident reports," Chin interrupted, her voice cutting through his stammering like a scalpel. "We have testimony from nurses who were threatened into silence. We have documentation of cover-ups that spanned 6 years." The side door of the conference room opened, and Williams watched his world collapse in real time as Ms. Eleanor walked in, flanked by Jessica, Marcus, and 6 other nurses from Metropolitan. They moved to stand beside the vice president with the unified determination of people who decided that silence was no longer survivable. Ms. Eleanor stepped to the microphone, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "We have testimony. We have records we kept in secret because the official ones kept disappearing. We've been silent too long, and children died because of our silence. Dr. Williams created a culture where questioning his authority meant destroying your career. We watched him prioritize his ego over patient care, and we said nothing because we were afraid." Her voice broke on the last word, but she didn't step away from the microphone. Helen Carter wasn't afraid. She saved a child's life and paid the price. We should have been brave enough to stand with her. We're standing now. Williams tried to speak, tried to reclaim control of a narrative that was disintegrating around him, but his voice was lost in the roar of reporters shouting questions, cameras clicking, the machinery of public accountability grinding to life. A man in a dark suit approached the podium Metropolitan's board chairman, his face ashen. Effective immediately, Dr. Raymond Williams is suspended from all clinical and administrative duties pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The final blow came from Patricia Gonzalez, the HHS investigator, standing at the back of the room with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd spent 3 days building an airtight case. The Department of Justice will be filing criminal charges against Dr. Williams. Negligent homicide in the death of Maya Rodriguez. Falsifying medical records. Obstruction of federal oversight. Additional charges may follow as the investigation continues. Williams collapsed into the chair behind him, his pristine suit suddenly looking like a costume, his 30-year legacy reduced to rubble in the span of 15 minutes. The cameras captured everything. His face, drained of color and certainty. The nurses standing together in defiance. Vice President Shun, embodying the fury of every parent whose child had been failed by a system that protected power over patients. The press conference ended, but the reckoning had just begun. 6 months later, Helen Carter sat in a different kind of spotlight, the witness table in a congressional hearing room, facing a semicircle of senators who held the power to transform her personal catastrophe into systemic change. The room was packed with nurses, physicians, hospital administrators, and advocates who traveled from across the country to watch history unfold in real time. Senator Patricia Whitmore leaned toward her microphone. Ms. Carter, can you tell us in your own words what the proposed legislation would mean for medical professionals? Helen's hands rested on the table, steady now in a way they hadn't been 6 months ago when she'd been sitting on a curb clutching her mother's stethoscope. When I chose to save Stephen Washington's life, I thought I was ending my career. I didn't know I was starting a movement. She paused, gathering her thoughts with the same precision she'd used to calculate pediatric blood ratios in a makeshift surgical suite. The Carter Protocol would provide legal protection for medical professionals who act in good faith during emergencies when following standard protocol would result in patient harm. It creates a framework for clinical judgment to override administrative barriers when lives are at immediate risk. The legislation passed 3 weeks later with bipartisan support, a rarity in modern politics. But suffering children had a way of transcending party lines. Vice President Shun stood beside the president as he signed it into law, and Helen watched from the audience wearing the same scrubs she'd been fired in, now framed and mounted in the Smithsonian as part of an exhibit on medical advocacy. Metropolitan Children's Hospital had undergone a transformation that looked less like reform and more like revolution. The entire executive leadership had been replaced. The Quality Assurance Committee had been dissolved and rebuilt with mandatory nurse representation. The culture of silence had been excavated and replaced with protocols that treated frontline clinical judgment as essential rather than insubordinate. And Helen Carter, 29 years old with student loans, she was finally paying down in a grief for her mother that had transformed from weight into wings, had been appointed director of pediatric emergency medicine, the youngest person ever to hold the position. The pediatric wing had been renamed in a ceremony that Helen had barely survived without crying. The Elena Carter Memorial Wing bore her mother's name in bronze letters above the entrance, a permanent monument to a nurse who died believing her work didn't matter. Helen knew better now. Her mother's work had mattered enough to inspire a daughter who refused to stay silent. Dr. Raymond Williams was serving an 8-year sentence in federal prison. His medical license had been permanently revoked. His name had been stripped from the hospital plaques. His legacy had been reduced to a cautionary tale about what happens when ego becomes more important than the Hippocratic Oath. Helen stood now in a classroom filled with first-year nursing students, young faces looking up at her with the nervous hope of people about to enter a profession that would break them and rebuild them and ask them to choose courage over compliance every single day. She held up her mother's stethoscope, the vintage Littman with Elena Carter's name worn smooth on the chest piece. This belonged to a nurse who died, believing her work didn't matter. I'm here to tell you it does. Your hands save lives. Your voice changes systems. Don't let anyone make you small. Don't let anyone tell you that following orders matters more than following your clinical judgment. And don't ever let anyone convince you that being a nurse means being silent. The classroom door opened. 2 children walked in on Stephen Washington, now 8 years old and healthy, his sickle cell disease managed by a team that included 3 nurses Helen had personally trained. Beside him, Vice President Chin's grandson, 6 years old with a scar on his abdomen and a future that had almost been stolen by a car accident. Both boys were alive because Helen Carter had refused to wait for permission. The nursing students erupted in applause, understanding in their marrow what this moment meant, that their profession had power, that their voices mattered, that the hierarchy could be challenged and changed. Helen walked to the doors, the same floor-to-ceiling glass barriers that had once ejected her into unemployment and despair. They'd been rebuilt after the helicopter landing, reinforced and redesigned. But Helen Carter didn't need the doors to be different. She was different. She pushed through them with purpose, her white coat bearing her new title, her mother's stethoscope around her neck, and a generation of young nurses following behind her unafraid, empowered, ready to save lives and change the world. The glass doors closed behind them with a whisper, not a gavel. This time, they were walking in.